Trump scraps the Iran nuclear deal, hasn't even read it, and were electoral politics all up in the decision? This political year is like none other, except that of 1974 when Watergate was raging. But what's bubbling below the surface in the minds of voters, and can we even name it? Primary season is in full swing, and Maryland gubernatorial candidate Ben Jealous and New Mexico congressional candidate Deb Haaland, who could become the first Native American woman elected to Congress ever, join us to talk about their races. All that and more on today's The Last Sip. Welcome to The Last Sip. It's been yet another boring week in the news, hardly. In the latest episode of The White House Apprentice, Donald Trump junked the Iran nuclear deal just as it was beginning to work. Who's surprised? Rudy Giuliani resigned from his law firm after contradictory statements about what both Donald Trump and his lawyer Michael Cohen knew and when they came to know it. And Rihanna arrived at the Met Ball looking like a bishop right out of an adult film. But the most important trends this week are political. That's why, with the nation moving into the consequential primary season, we will devote this entire program to electoral politics. First up is Hannah Allam, reporter at Buzzfeed, to discuss the domestic political calculus behind shredding the Iran nuclear deal and whether Islamophobia played a role. After that, we'll speak with Democratic Maryland gubernatorial candidate Ben Jealous about why he's running for political office for the first time and why progressive politics seems to be taking hold across the country. We then pick up that topic again with Hannah to discuss the two apparent extreme minds of voters, one seemingly seeking a return to the era of the Morse code and the other hurtling towards the age of AI. Lastly, Deb Haaland speaks to us about using our present to end a relic of the past, namely the fact that a Native woman has not sat in the U.S. Congress since America's founding. On to the first sip. Joining us now is Hannah Allam of Buzzfeed to talk about how Donald Trump's continued courting of his base may have been a factor in the decision to walk away from the Iran nuclear deal. That agreement between Iran and all the major global powers and the United Nations froze Iran's nuclear program for 10 years in exchange for the lifting of sanctions on that country. Before the deal, Iran was just months away from acquiring a nuclear bomb, a time frame which could reassert itself should the deal collapse altogether. Hannah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Actually, with us side by side, someone from the Last Sip team said that this is the curl show. So I'm happy to share curls with you. Can you just recap how Donald Trump during the campaign used the Iran nuclear deal with his base during the 26 campaign and how symbolically and why symbolically it's important to his supporters?
Sure. If you remember the 2016 campaign, then candidate Trump really took every opportunity to sort of trash the Iran deal, to call it a bad deal, a one-sided deal. He made lots of statements that fact checkers at the time and since have called misleading, exaggerated, or lacking in context about exactly, what the U.S. was or wasn't getting out of the deal and what Iran was or wasn't getting out of the deal. And so certainly these statements played well, even if they weren't always exactly accurate, according to the fact checkers who are watching it very closely. And, it sort of is it seems to be his broader mission to sort of vilify the region. It's a region of terror. Iran in particular is an archenemy of the United States. And so he really did use that kind of language at every turn, not only about Iran, but definitely about the Middle East in general and Arabs and Muslims in particular. And so, yes, this was a fulfilling of that campaign promise that he would, he wanted to tear up the deal. He thought it was a bad deal, and so he has. And it wasn't really surprising to a lot of people who've been watching him and listening to this rhetoric for some time. But now that it is, that's what he's done. He's reversed it. He's abandoned that deal. Now we are entering a time of uncertainty about what it means going forward for Iran, for the allies who were involved, the other partner nations that were involved in this deal. And so I think it's a bit early to tell the true fallout, but there's a lot of concern.
I mean, what's interesting from a domestic political standpoint, right, on this particular issue, is the fact that he courts the breakings of all of these international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord, and all the rest of it, walking away from TPP, even if you agree with that. But the way that he frames them is that it's asserting American sort of sway. It's America getting its mojo back. It's setting itself loose from all of these international constraints that aren't bad for us. But what's interesting is that in almost every single case, what it's actually done is isolate the United States, right? So Angela Merkel's response, for example, the Chancellor of Germany, who's key to this deal with Iran, her response wasn't like, oh, well, the deal's done. I mean, her response was, the deal is still on, and all this means is that the United States doesn't look out for our interests anymore, and we can't count on Americans to protect us. The Paris climate deal has actually gained signatories since the United States left. Nicaragua, which wasn't a signatory, has signed on, and there's some others. So what it's doing is that it seems to be isolating the United States, and that's something that's interesting. He's framing as it's making us stronger and it plays to a certain base in America, but in reality, it's doing the opposite, it seems.
Well, it certainly hasn't pleased the allies. And not just, France, Germany, and the UK, which issued a joint statement of basically saying we're concerned and disappointed that at this outcome. But I mean, Russia and China also issued more muted criticisms of the decision to pull out. So, sort of concern across the board for the parties that were in this deal. And of course, in Iran, there are fears among Iran watchers that this might embolden the hardline sort of power bases in Iran. And of course, it's also a disappointment to a generation of young Iranians who had hoped that maybe this thaw meant that they would know a time when the U.S. and Iran could have full diplomatic relations. Many of them have come of age without ever having known that as a reality. So across the board, really just sort of disappointment, puzzlement, uncertainty about what's happening next.
Mm-hmm. And again, though, I mean, they may not necessarily know an age of normal relations with the United States, but they're certainly going to know an age of normal relations with the British and the French and the Germans and the Chinese and all of the rest of it. So it's not stopping the deal from actually proceeding. Everyone has said that they are going to continue to abide by it. We'll see whether or not that happens, but that's been the response. And so it's isolating the United States. And it's interesting whether or not that isolationism does actually play into a political sentiment that he is relying on for November.
Right. Well, I think that, that doesn't sound like a bad outcome to many, people who voted for Trump and who believe in his sort of America first, what's been a very, described as a very nativist, xenophobic agenda that he's rolled out both in policy as well as, what he'd promised on the campaign trail and what he continues to say from the White House. So certainly to probably a large portion of his base, kind of pulling out from these, going it alone, asserting American power, all those things, and American individualism, and this sort of is part and parcel with that broader message of America first. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And all that does, though, is that at the same time, it may, as we've spoken about, sort of put us further at risk, at least in terms of isolationism. And if Iran, for whatever reason, if the domestic political situation there changes, they could easily go back to having a bomb in a very short period of time, and that would actually put us in real risk, not only in terms of isolationism. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. We're looking at a world without American leadership and what happens when that happens. And I think it's a giant question mark, and none of us really know the outcome.
That's right. And, I used to cover State Department, and I covered it, during the negotiation of the Iran deal, as well as during the negotiation of the Paris Accords. And, I think diplomats said then, and they'll say now, that it might sound good, America first, and this policy of isolationism, but that treaties and diplomatic relations, and bilateral and multilateral relations, that they all serve long-term American interests, both security interests as well as interests in promoting American values of democracy and certain American freedoms to the world, and really that, and of course, upholding human rights and things like that. So all those sorts of conversations that used to, have the United States at the center. Yes, there is a sense among many diplomats, American here at the State Department, as well as other foreign diplomats, that that seat is now up for grabs, and who's going to lead those kinds of talks on the world stage.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how the world responds to a world, as you say, that was created by the United States after World War II, which the United States is now abandoning. What happens in all of that? But thank you for taking us through all of the complicated international and domestic political angles of this and what is going on. But don't go away, because we're going to be talking to you more later in the program. So please stick around.